He had a voice that didn't just sing, it testified. It was the sound of a man who carried both love and pain in the same breath, the kind of tone that made truth feel like melody. Somewhere between Georgia's red clay roads and the neon lights of New York, he found his calling not in fame, but in honesty. What happens to the artists who once gave soul music its heartbeat when the world forgets their names? This is the story of Roy C., a man whose songs spoke louder than the applause he never received. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the lights, before the microphone, there was a boy named Roy Charles Hammond, born on the 3rd of August, 1939, in Newton, Georgia. His father, George Hammond, worked the railroads, while his mother, Annie Joy, kept the family steady through long southern summers and quiet, prayer-filled nights. The world around them was divided by color lines, but music was the one thing that crossed them all. In small towns like Newton, Sunday mornings carried the sound of gospel through open church windows. Choirs lifted their voices high enough to reach the heavens, and little Roy was there, listening. He didn't know it then, but those harmonies would become his compass, teaching him how truth could live inside a song. When his family moved north to New York, Roy carried that southern sound with him like a memory he couldn't let go of. The city was loud and fast, a world away from the slow rhythm of Georgia. Street corners were filled with doo-wop groups harmonizing under streetlights, their voices echoing off brick walls. It was a new kind of education, one that didn't come from books, but from rhythm, breath, and survival. At first, Roy dreamed of becoming a boxer. He trained hard, fast, and fearless, stepping into the ring with the same drive that would later define his music. But a brutal sparring session with heavyweight Hurricane Jackson changed everything. The blows didn't just end a dream, they opened another door. He realized his real strength wasn't in his fists, but in his voice. By the late 1950s, he joined a short-lived doo-wop group called the Genies. They weren't famous, but they had something real, the raw sound of young men trying to turn hope into harmony. Roy's tenor stood out. It was smooth but heavy, carrying both longing and conviction. Their regional success gave him a taste of the stage, but the group soon broke apart. For Roy, it wasn't the end, just another beginning. Those early years in New York were tough. Record labels were selective, radio airplay was limited, and the industry rarely gave second chances to black artists without big city connections. Roy worked odd jobs, saved his pay, and spent nights writing songs. He sang anywhere that would have him: bars, clubs, and small recording studios hidden in basements. People around him began to notice something different. His lyrics weren't just about romance, they were about truth, the kind that came from lived experience. Even then, before anyone knew his name, Roy C. was writing about the world as he saw it, the broken promises, the small victories, and the everyday pain of ordinary people. He had grown up in a time when America was changing, when soul music wasn't just entertainment but survival. For many young black men like Roy, the microphone became a weapon of honesty. His voice, steeped in gospel and grounded in struggle, began to take shape. There's an image people remember from those days, a young man standing outside a recording studio, holding a notebook full of songs, watching cars pass by. He didn't look like the future of soul music, but in his heart, he already knew. Someday, the world will hear what I have to say. By the early 1960s, Roy was honing his sound, blending Southern gospel warmth with New York grit. He was learning that the best music didn't need to be pretty, it needed to be true. And Roy's truth came from the tension between where he came from and where he was trying to go. Every voice that ever made history started as a whisper. For Roy, it began in the small-town churches of Georgia and the crowded tenements of New York, the two worlds that shaped his soul. Those memories never left him. They lived in every note he would later sing, every lyric he would write, and every truth he would tell. Before the fame, before the applause, before the world knew his name, there was just a young man from Georgia, walking home from another long night of singing, believing that one day his music would matter. By 1965, Roy had found his voice, not the polished kind that filled radio stations, but the kind that spoke to real people. He adopted the name Roy C. and released a single that would define his arrival, Shotgun Wedding. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sweet. It was raw, funny, and uncomfortably real, a story about the messy side of love, about consequences and choices. The song caught people by surprise. In an era when most R&B was about fantasy and romance, Roy sang about responsibility and truth. Shotgun Wedding climbed the charts both in the United States and overseas, and suddenly, a man who had been ignored for years was hearing his record on national radio. For the first time, Roy C. was more than a dreamer, he was a name. But behind that success was a man who never felt completely comfortable in the spotlight. Fame, even in small doses, didn't come easy for someone who grew up counting every dollar and fighting for every opportunity. The industry was quick to praise his talent, but slow to offer real support. He saw how labels used artists, how they shaped their image, how truth was often the first thing to go. Roy didn't want to be shaped. He wanted to speak. After Shotgun Wedding, he began writing songs for other performers, sharpening his craft and learning how the business worked. He studied how records were made, how royalties were handled, how easily a musician could lose control of his own voice. That understanding turned into defiance. In the early 1970s, when other artists signed away their rights, Roy did something few dared to do. He started his own label. It was a bold move for a man who came from nothing, but independence was his only way to stay honest. He named it 3 Gems and began producing, recording, and distributing his own music. Roy's sound was different now. It carried the warmth of Southern soul, but with a streetwise edge born from New York. His songs were like short stories, tales of betrayal, seduction, laughter, and pain. He sang about infidelity in I Found a Man in My Bed, and the bittersweet truth of moving on in I'm Gonna Love Someone Else's Woman. It wasn't about shock value, it was about life as it really was. Audiences loved his unfiltered honesty. Critics didn't always understand it. To them, Roy's music was too direct, too emotional, too real. But that's what made him unique. He wasn't trying to sound like anyone else, he was trying to sound like himself. There's a moment that fans still talk about, a performance in a small southern club. Lights dim, band tight, audience swaying to the rhythm. Roy leans into the microphone, closes his eyes, and sings a line that silences the room. You can almost feel it, the truth inside the note, the ache of someone who's lived every word. By the time the night ends, no one's asking who he is. They already know. As the decade turned, Roy C. stood at a crossroads. The radio was changing. Funk was getting louder, disco was beginning to rise, and soul, his kind of soul, was being pushed aside. But Roy wasn't built to chase trends. He was built to tell the truth. He began writing songs that carried more weight, pieces that didn't just speak about love, but about the world itself. In 1971, while America was divided by war, he wrote Open Letter to the President, a direct message to Washington about Vietnam and the cost of human life. It wasn't the kind of song record labels wanted. It was too bold, too political, too honest. But that honesty was exactly who Roy C. was. He followed it with I Wasn't There, But I Can Feel the Pain, a song about slavery and inherited trauma. It wasn't entertainment, it was remembrance. It was history told through a melody. For every fan who danced to Shotgun Wedding, there was another who now stopped and listened, hearing something deeper in his voice, the pain of a nation that still hadn't healed. By 1973, he recorded his first major album, Sex and Soul. It was more than just a title, it was a statement. Roy believed the two couldn't be separated. The same fire that burned in passion also burned in protest. The record mixed the physical and the spiritual, the personal and the political. For him, desire and dignity came from the same place, the truth of being human. But the song that would define his career and change the course of hip-hop decades later came soon after, Impeach the President. Recorded with a young Queens group called the Honey Drippers, the track was a protest wrapped in rhythm. Its drum break was simple, steady, unforgettable. When Roy took the song to Mercury Records, they refused to release it. It was too controversial. They told him he'd be more successful if he stayed away from politics. He didn't listen. Roy released the record himself. It didn't top the charts, but it planted something much more powerful, a seed that would grow long after the headlines faded. The song became a quiet anthem for the streets, for the people who believed in accountability and truth. Years later, hip-hop would discover that same drumbeat, and it would become one of the most sampled rhythms in history. At the time, though, Roy had no idea what he'd created. He just knew he had to keep going. He recorded 3 albums for Mercury Sex and Soul in 1973, Something Nice in 1975, and More Sex and Soul in 1977. Each carried that unmistakable blend of tenderness and defiance, love and rebellion. Roy's music wasn't built for the mainstream. It was built for the soul, for anyone who'd ever loved too deeply or believed too strongly. He wasn't trying to be a star. He was trying to be honest. And somewhere between those records, between the radio silence and the stubborn hope, Roy found his place not at the top of the charts, but in the hearts of those who needed his music most. He once said in an interview, "I never sang to get famous. I sang so people could feel something real." That was his turning point. From that moment on, Roy C. stopped chasing fame. He started chasing truth. By the mid-1970s, Roy C. had built something rare in the world of soul freedom. While most artists depended on major labels, he controlled his own music, his own message, and his own sound. The stage may not have been as big, but it was his. And for Roy, ownership was its own kind of victory. When Sex and Soul hit the shelves, listeners didn't just hear songs, they heard confessions. His music was intimate but fearless, carrying both the heat of desire and the weight of conscience. The album wasn't polished like Motown or as orchestrated as Philadelphia Soul. It was something different, the sound of a man who refused to filter his truth. Something Nice followed in 1975, showing a softer, more reflective side of Roy. He wrote about temptation, about the quiet struggles of love and fidelity, about the small decisions that could change a life. He had a way of turning ordinary emotions into timeless lessons. Each song felt like a late-night conversation, honest, unguarded, and deeply human. By 1977, More Sex and Soul completed the trilogy. It was mature, confident, and unapologetically Southern. The themes were familiar: love, loneliness, faith, betrayal, but the delivery was richer, more seasoned. You could hear the years in his voice, the kind that didn't just sing a note but lived through it. While radio stations chased trends, Roy C. built his own audience one performance at a time. In small Southern clubs, he became a legend. Fans would travel from towns miles away just to hear him sing. There was something in his delivery that no hit single could capture. He didn't perform for applause, he performed to connect. His shows weren't about spectacle, they were about truth. The lights were dim, the crowd close, and every word carried a pulse. When Roy leaned into the microphone and sang about heartbreak, people didn't just listen, they nodded, they remembered, they felt it too. And still, even at his peak, Roy never forgot where he came from. Between sets, he'd talk about his parents, about Georgia, about the train whistles he used to hear as a child. He reminded his audience that music was meant to heal, not to impress. For many who saw him live during those years, it wasn't just a concert, it was a confession shared between souls. They didn't need fame to tell them who Roy C. was. They knew him through the honesty in his voice, through the laughter that came after a painful lyric, through the silence that followed a truth too heavy to explain. Those were his golden years, not defined by awards or headlines, but by connection. While others chased stardom, Roy C. built something purer: respect. Success, for Roy C., never came without a shadow. Even as his music found a loyal audience, the world around him was changing. The late 1970 brought disco, and with it came a sound that didn't leave much room for slow-burning truth. The industry wanted energy, not empathy. And for artists like Roy, who built their craft on storytelling and honesty, that shift was devastating. He saw record executives chase numbers instead of meaning. The music business became faster, colder, and less forgiving. For every artist that rose overnight, another one disappeared in silence. Roy had no interest in chasing trends, but standing still in a moving world can make even the strongest artist feel left behind. It wasn't just the business that changed, it was the culture. Radio stations began to narrow their playlists. Independent soul artists lost airtime. Major labels absorbed smaller ones. Suddenly, the world that had once celebrated raw emotion now wanted something easier, something you could dance to without thinking too hard. Roy C. wasn't made for that kind of compromise. He kept writing songs, still pressing his own records, still performing in small venues across the South. But the crowds began to thin. The faces that once filled his shows were getting older, responsibilities heavier. The same people who once lived by his music now had families, jobs, and lives that pulled them away. That's the quiet tragedy of real musicians. Their truth doesn't fade, but the audience does. Then came the moment that sealed his frustration, the label's rejection of Impeach the President. To Roy, it wasn't just about politics. It was about being silenced for telling the truth. He believed music had the power to challenge, to question, to stand up for something bigger. When Mercury Records refused to back the song, it broke something in him. They told him to stick to love songs, as if love and justice couldn't exist in the same breath. Years later, in a 2011 interview, Roy said, "They told me I'd be bigger if I kept quiet." You could hear both defiance and sadness in his voice. He knew that choosing integrity meant giving up success, and he made that choice anyway. The irony, of course, is that Impeach the President would outlive every hit that ever charted against him. But in that moment, he couldn't see the future. All he felt was the weight of being unheard. As the 1980 approached, Roy's independence came at a price. Without major distribution, his records reached fewer stores. Without promotion, his songs reached fewer ears. Still, he never stopped recording. He wrote hundreds of tracks, some political, some personal, all honest. The stage lights may have dimmed, but the studio lights stayed on. There's an image of him from that period sitting alone in a small studio, a reel spinning, a notebook on the console. His hands rest on the table, his eyes half closed, as if listening for something only he could hear. Maybe it was the rhythm of an America that no longer listened. Or maybe it was the sound of his own resilience. He never called it a downfall. To him, it was just another chapter. But for those who loved his music, it was the beginning of silence, the kind that lasts longer than applause. The 1980 should have been a time of recognition for Roy C. He had already written the songs, built his own label, and earned the respect of his peers. But the world of music rarely rewards quiet persistence. For every hit that defined the decade, there were 100 voices that never made it to radio, and his was one of them. Roy found himself standing in a strange place between eras. The new sound of soul was synthetic, built from machines and polished production. His sound was too human for that world. It breathed, it cracked, it wept, and in an age of perfection, imperfection had no place. The phone calls came less often. The stage offers slowed down. He still performed, but the crowds were smaller, the lights dimmer. Yet he kept his dignity, carrying himself like a man who knew that his worth wasn't measured by charts or ticket sales. He had built a life on independence, and that same independence now became his only companion. Roy turned inward. He wrote more than ever, not just songs, but ideas, reflections, pieces of memory. He became his own archivist, preserving what the world ignored. In interviews, he never spoke with bitterness. He spoke with clarity. "They can't silence the truth," he said once. "They can only stop playing it." But the struggle was real. The business side of music had become ruthless. Distributors collapsed, small record stores closed, and the artists who owned their masters often found themselves invisible to a system built for profit. Roy's self-run label, while noble, couldn't compete with the giants. Albums were pressed in small batches and sold at shows or by mail. Still, he refused to stop. The studio was his sanctuary. Even when money was tight, he recorded. When health issues began to show, he recorded. When the world forgot, he recorded. The man simply didn't know how to quit. Behind that resilience, though, there was exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. He had carried the same message for decades, that music could be a mirror for the truth, and sometimes the reflection he saw was too heavy to bear. Friends remember visiting him in those years, always the same small studio, always the same old tape machines. Roy would play a track, close his eyes, and say, "You hear that? That's what real soul feels like." Then he'd smile, half proud, half sad, as if aware that fewer and fewer people were listening. It's a quiet kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't make headlines but lingers in the silence afterward. Roy C. was living proof that authenticity doesn't always win in the world of fame, but it does endure. He once said that his songs were letters to the people, and even when no one wrote back, he kept sending them one record, one truth at a time. By the 1990s, Roy C. had become something of a ghost in the industry he helped shape. His name was no longer on radio charts, but his sound, those unmistakable rhythms and confessional lyrics, lived quietly inside the DNA of American music. The tragedy was simple. Everyone had heard him, but almost no one knew it. Hollywood and the major music world had moved on, building new idols, new trends, new illusions. But down south, in the small clubs and weekend festivals, Roy still performed. He didn't chase fame anymore. He just wanted connection. Each night on stage felt like revisiting a piece of himself, a reminder that the spotlight didn't define him. The music did. Still, there were nights when the silence spoke louder than applause. Touring wasn't easy. Travel costs rose, health declined, and the audiences that once packed his shows began to fade away. Time, as always, was the hardest critic. In those years, he poured himself into writing and producing for others. He recorded albums for artists like Dennis Edwards and Bobby Stringer, often working behind the scenes under his own small label. There was something noble about it, an artist who had once stood at the microphone, now standing quietly behind it, helping others find their voice. But the lack of recognition took its toll. Roy C. was too proud to complain, yet too honest to pretend it didn't hurt. When interviewers asked how he felt about being overlooked, he'd shrug and say, "Maybe I was just born before my time." There was truth in that. His songs carried messages that would later become universal honesty, struggle, and the courage to question authority. But when he first sang them, the world wasn't ready to listen. By the 2000s, he had become a living archive, a man whose music told a story few wanted to face. Still, hip-hop's new generation found him again. Producers began digging through old vinyl crates, rediscovering Impeach the President and sampling its timeless drum break. Tupac, Biggie, LL Cool J, Mary J. Blige, their hits were built on the foundation he had laid decades earlier. That realization brought him quiet satisfaction. He might not have had the spotlight, but he had legacy. "They took my beat," he once joked, "but they can never take my soul." Even as his health declined, he stayed creative. He recorded into his late 70s, speaking in interviews about wanting to re-record Impeach the President in protest of modern politics. The fire never left him, it just burned lower, steadier, wiser. In the end, Roy C.'s decline wasn't a fall from grace. It was a slow fade, the kind that happens when the world looks away, not because you lost your gift, but because it forgot to remember. And yet, through it all, his truth remained untouched. He didn't need a chart position to know his worth. He had already made his mark not in the headlines, but in the heartbeat of American music. In the story of American soul, there are artists who chased the spotlight, and there are artists who built it. Roy C. belonged to the second kind. His influence didn't shout. It lingered, quietly reshaping the sound of generations that followed. When hip-hop emerged from block parties and basement studios in New York, the beat that moved the crowd often came from Roy's Impeach the President. That single drum break, steady, sharp, and soulful, became a cornerstone of rhythm for an entire genre. It was used by DJ Kool Herc and Afrika Bambaataa in the early days of the movement. Decades later, it resurfaced in songs by the Notorious B.I.G., Tupac, LL Cool J, Mary J. Blige, Kanye West, Jay-Z, and Frank Ocean. Each time that drum hit, a piece of Roy's voice echoed through a new generation. Most listeners didn't know his name, but they felt his rhythm, the truth he recorded in that small Queens studio back in the early 1970s. Without ever stepping into a hip-hop session, Roy became part of its foundation. But his legacy wasn't just musical, it was moral. Roy C. represented a generation of black artists who refused to separate art from reality. His songs carried messages that were bigger than radio play. He sang about war when others stayed silent, about injustice when it was safer not to speak. In a time when the industry told him to sing love songs, he chose to sing about the world. That defiance became his signature. In interviews later in life, he often said that he saw music as a public service, not just entertainment. "If a song doesn't mean something," he once said, "it doesn't deserve to be sung." That belief gave his catalog a rare kind of weight. Even the playful tracks carried a heartbeat of truth underneath. American soul critics have called him the conscience of Southern soul. His work bridged the sensual and the spiritual, the romantic, and the revolutionary. He wasn't a preacher, but he spoke like one, not from the pulpit, but from behind a microphone. In the American South, especially in small towns and regional radio circuits, his name never truly disappeared. There were DJs who kept spinning his records, fans who played his songs at weddings, reunions, and Sunday cookouts. For them, Roy C. wasn't a forgotten legend, he was family. And yet, for every loyal listener, there were millions who didn't realize they'd been dancing to his sound for years. That's the quiet irony of his legacy. Invisible fame, eternal influence. When you trace the roots of modern soul, R&B, and hip-hop, you find Roy C. somewhere in the middle, not in the headlines, but in the heartbeat. His life became proof that you don't need the world's recognition to change its rhythm. Outside the United States, Roy C.'s name might not appear in history books, but his sound traveled farther than he ever did. British DJs in the late 20th century began spinning his records in underground soul clubs, celebrating the raw, human quality that commercial radio had long forgotten. Across Europe, collectors hunted for his vinyl, cherishing each crackle and imperfection as proof of authenticity. It was through those records worn, loved, passed from hand to hand that Roy's message crossed oceans. His music carried something universal, honesty. Whether you grew up in Georgia or London, the ache in his voice felt familiar. It spoke of struggle, of love, of truth denied and dignity reclaimed. In that way, Roy C. became an unintentional ambassador of real soul, the kind that outlives fame. In the early 2000s, the hip-hop generation gave his work a second life. Sampling became not just a trend, but a form of reverence. Young producers from Japan to France built entire beats around Impeach the President, not knowing the face behind the rhythm. To them, the sound wasn't just a loop, it was a heartbeat that connected eras, races, and continents. That's how legacy works when it's real. You can erase the name, but you can't erase the truth. Music journalists have since written essays calling Impeach the President one of the most important drum patterns in modern music. It became part of university lectures on hip-hop history, cited as a cultural bridge between protest, soul, and rap activism. Through that single record, Roy's message about accountability and power reached a generation that wasn't even born when he first pressed record. In 2019, when asked by Vice if he would ever re-record Impeach the President, Roy smiled. "Maybe," he said, "if the world still needs it." That answer said everything he knew. The song's relevance would never fade. Each new political storm, each new voice demanding change, proved that his music was built for time itself. When Roy C. passed away on the 17th of September 2020, the tributes came quietly. Fans shared memories online, musicians posted covers, and hip-hop producers thanked him for the rhythm that shaped their craft. There were no grand ceremonies, no flashing headlines, just respect, genuine and earned. In small radio stations from Alabama to London, DJs played Shotgun Wedding and Impeach the President back-to-back, reminding listeners that sometimes the greatest contributions come from those who never asked for credit. That's how the world remembers Roy C., not through statues or awards, but through echoes. Each time a new artist samples his beat, each time a young singer finds courage in his story, he lives again. He may have been underrated, even forgotten by the industry, but the truth he sang remains undefeated. And that's the kind of immortality only real artists ever find. The story of Roy C. isn't about fame lost. It's about truth remembered. He came from the red clay roads of Georgia and carved his name, quietly, into the backbone of American music. His songs didn't scream for attention, they whispered the kind of honesty that never goes out of style. When the spotlight moved on, Roy stayed where he'd always been, close to the people. He sang for working men and women, for those who felt invisible, for anyone who had ever loved deeply and been hurt for it. His voice became a refuge, a place where truth could breathe. Even in silence, his legacy grew. Every time a hip-hop record borrowed his beat, every time a young artist found courage in his defiance, Roy's spirit lived on. The world may not have shouted his name, but it has been humming his rhythm for decades. That's how real influence works, it hides in plain sight. He once said that a song without meaning isn't worth singing. Looking back at his life, you realize he never broke that rule. Every lyric carried a purpose, every melody a confession. He wasn't trying to please, he was trying to be honest. And in that honesty, he became timeless. When you listen to his voice now, those deep, unpolished tones, that gentle conviction, you can almost hear a whole generation inside it. The struggles, the laughter, the faith, the sound of a man who refused to lie, even when silence was easier. Roy C. may not have the awards or the headlines, but he has something far greater: authenticity, the kind of legacy that doesn't fade when the charts change, the kind that lives in hearts, not in numbers. So, if you ever hear that familiar drum beat, the one from Impeach the President, or the slow ache of Shotgun Wedding, remember the man behind it. Remember the artist who believed music should mean something. Do you think Hollywood ever gave him the respect he truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep his light alive. Because remembering isn't just nostalgia, it's justice. Some stars fade when the lights go out, but some, like Roy C., keep shining quietly, long after the world stops looking.